Hi, for this lecture, I'm going to talk about servant leadership. And servant leadership was developed by Robert Greenleaf, who died in 1990. He was a AT&T executive, and he had researched leadership for 40 years. He founded the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership in Indianapolis, and he picked Indiana probably because he was born in Terre Haute. Servant leadership started with an essay he authored in 1970. And while he was an executive at AT&T, he was sent to Europe on business. And so his entertainment for the flight was he purchased a novel by Herman Hesse called A Journey to the East. And this novel was written in 1932, but it's still available. You can purchase it today. And I might say, too, it's a fast read. Yeah, it's the type of you sit down, you're going to read it in an hour and a half or so. The narrator is H.H., and I assume you know that Herman Hesse. And H.H. joins the league, and the group is kind of vague in description, and it's mysterious and maybe even mystical. And H.H. took a vow of silence not to divulge its purpose. And his initiation into the league was to do this journey to the east with a group of other candidates who were being initiated into the league, and their destination actually was unknown. And each member of the journey had a different goal as well as a different role to perform. And there was a servant named Leo who was very charismatic and positive in spirit. And he was the type of person just seems to sense the needs of someone. You know, like you wake up and you're thinking, the guy should be nice to have coffee, and suddenly there's Leo with a cup of coffee. And they were approaching a challenge in their journey. And it was a deep gorge that they had to cross, and it was called Morbio Inferior. And just before the eve before they are to take on this challenge, Leo the servant disappears. And coincidentally, things seem to be missing, and the attitudes of people on the journey start to change. And next thing you know, they're blaming Leo. So no wonder he disappeared. He took our stuff too. And so one by one, frustration and in this blaming mode, members abandoned the journey. And this included H.H. He abandoned the journey and returned to his life. And then later, after time had passed, he tries to sit down and recreate the journey in writing. In other words, he wants to journal about the experience. And for some reason, Leo kept coming up in his reflections, and he kept thinking that there was something important about Leo. And so he searches and discovers a city where Leo lives, and he did that by checking phone directories. And he finally he actually went to that city and in search of Leo, and he reached the point where he had an encounter with Leo. And so at first Leo didn't even recognize him, and but eventually they started talking, and so Leo invited H.H. to attend the league meeting and to come before the high throne to be judged because, you know, after all, he abandoned the journey and allegedly the league. So when it comes to his moment in time, H.H. is asked, would he prefer to be judged by a panel or by the president of the league himself? And so it turns out that the servant Leo actually turned out to be president of the league. And the Morbio Inferior Gorge was a test. And he acquits H.H. of desertion and gives him an assignment to read about himself in the league archives and learn the truth. So Greenleaf had doubts about the effectiveness of autocratic leadership which prevailed in Greenleaf's time. And the role of Leo in this novel inspired Greenleaf to conceptualize servant leadership as an alternative to autocratic leadership. And therefore he founded the Greenleaf Center for Servant Leadership, and it was first called the Center for Applied Ethics. So he saw ethics and leadership as an important concept. And servant leadership begins with the individual. And notice it's a feeling that you have, that you desire to serve others. In other words, there's a calling to serve. And you aspire to lead because you want to serve the interests of others. And a servant leader is able to both accept and empathize with others. And I really like this next one. It says, those being served by the servant leader grow as persons, become wiser, more autonomous, and are more likely themselves to want to become servant leaders too. Now, so what are some characteristics of a servant leader? Well, they're listening as the foundation of leadership, empathy, healing, addressing the spiritual side of leadership, awareness, keeping in touch with ourselves and others, persuasion, beginning with the end in mind, conceptualization, seeing the big picture, foresight, plotting the course. I wonder how many executives had the foresight to see a world pandemic and how it might affect business. Stewardship, being accountable and sharing control. Commitment to the growth of people and building community. The servant leader has the desire to develop and grow themselves. And then being a servant leader requires listening to the strong feelings of the inner self, contemplation, and acting accordingly. So they're reflective. They're fully congruent with their actions and feelings. And it reminds me of something I learned from a researcher on values, that the measure of a bad decision is when you do something that contradicts your values. And so servant leaders have a high awareness of their values, and their actions are in alignment with their values. Notice the measures of effectiveness for a servant leader are much different than what are traditional. Do those being served by the leader grow as persons? Are they healthier? Are they wiser? Are they freer, more autonomous? Are they likely to become servant leaders themselves? And what is the effect of the leader on the least privileged members of the group? I like that one. Do they benefit from the leader's actions? And at the very least, are they not further deprived? Now, recently, 2018, Ken Blanchard, who is a co-founder of situational leadership, has married situational leadership with servant leadership, and they really work well together. And notice this quote here: we've all seen the impact of self-serving leaders in every sector of our society. Why is that? Is that because leaders have been conditioned to think of leadership only in terms of power and control? We think there's a better choice to lead at a higher level, and that's this synthesis of servant leadership with situational leadership. And so it's a very good concept to look into, and it's also often misunderstood. For example, servant leaders do hold people accountable. There's nothing soft about servant leadership, and I think it is a very attractive model for the time we're in. These are the references, and I will upload my slides along with the video. Thanks.